Good morning. My name is Margie O'Driscoll, and on behalf of the Center for Innovation's Board of Directors, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. We'd like to take a moment to express our gratitude to the many sponsors who make our work possible. We wouldn't be here today without your support. Thank you so much. Before we begin today's webinar, I'd like to share some news about upcoming events at CFI. We are planning an in-person event in the San Francisco Bay Area in September to one of the most challenging and innovative projects we have ever seen. The limited capacity of this event will restrict participation to sponsors only. If you haven't renewed your sponsorship in CFI, please contact me as soon as possible to get your paperwork in order so you can join your friends at the event we promise you will be talking about for the next year. CFI is also planning an event in September with a new sponsor for a demonstration of the most advanced drones available in the world. These drones are currently being used to evaluate building damage throughout the United States and the world, and will provide a level of detail to users that can provide an estimate of the amount of concrete you might need to repair a building. Are you curious? Do you want to play? Join us in September. We'll post details about this event on our newsletter and on our website. Now, to what you've been waiting for. I'd like to welcome you to a very interesting webinar. A couple of months ago, I read a New York Times editorial entitled, "The American Elevator Explains Why Housing Costs Have Skyrocketed." Okay, I was dumbfounded. The Center for Innovation has hosted numerous conversations with housing builders, developers, elected officials, and architects to try and understand the many obstacles to resolving one of the most vexing problems, not only in American cities, but throughout the world. In none of those conversations did anyone ever mention the word elevator. We were intrigued. So we tracked down the editorial author, Stephen Brown. He is the executive director of the Center for Building in North America, a nonprofit that conducts research and advocacy related to construction in the US and Canada. His organization seeks to understand how to improve costs and quality for multifamily buildings with an international comparative focus. Stephen's thesis is that the United States and Canada have the most expensive elevators in the world, roughly 3 times the cost of elevators in Western Europe, and fewer of them than in any other high-income country that he's examined in his research. Today, he's going to unpack for us the regulatory reasons behind these high costs and low availability, from codes and standards to labor. Stephen's joining us today from his home in New York City. Stephen, we're so excited to have you. We love people who get this technical with us. So please take it away.
Thank you. So my name is Stephen Smith. I'm the executive director of the Center for Building in North America. This was an organization that I founded about 2 years ago. I'd been active in what you could call the YIMBY movement, the Yes in My Backyard movement to reform land use laws across the country, and especially on the West Coast, as the zoning victories were being racked up. I was just noticing that the buildings being produced were not quite living up to expectations. And I started to get more interested in the nuts and bolts of construction, in particular building codes and standards. And I founded this organization. So the goal is to do research and a little bit of advocacy, mostly from an international comparative approach. It's a big world out there. They do things very differently than we do in America. And rather than reinventing the wheel, I thought it would be useful to study what works elsewhere. So the first big report we put out was about the cost of elevators. An elevator is a small part of a building, a big impact, especially when it's not there. And I thought it'd serve as sort of a microcosm, a lens to view the broader construction industry. So, an elevator is about 2% of the total cost of construction. So, I don't want to exaggerate about the impact of it, but I think that the themes that you find in the elevator industry you find them all throughout the construction industry. So it's my organization. Here's my email address. Please feel free to reach out. I'll have this again at the end. So my interest in this, on the left is the building I'm sitting in right now in Brooklyn. It's actually a single stair building, if you've been following any of that drama. It's 5 stories. And when I bought it, one of the things that appealed to me about it was the very low operating costs. On the left is my building in Brooklyn. And bought this in early 2021, and something that appealed to me, a global standpoint, by they're so low is because it doesn't have an elevator. It's a walk-up. It's a 5-story walk-up. On the right is my mother, who might be watching. Hello. This is her building in Bucharest, in the capital of Romania. It's a little bit bigger, but it was roughly the same if you take the total of the bill, given that housing costs in New York City are a little higher. And it does have an elevator. So I had a chronic illness for a couple of years, and it got a lot worse in 2021. I developed what's called POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. It involves faintness, dizziness, high heart rate upon standing, and it can make exertion kind of difficult. And I started to really regret buying a condo in a building that didn't have an elevator. Not that I had much of a choice given the price point in the neighborhood. I started wondering why does my building not have an elevator? I was traveling back and forth to see my mother, stopping to see a friend in Italy along the way. And I noticed, she's got a 3 or 4-story building that only has 2 units per floor. She's got an elevator. My mother's got an elevator in her building in Bucharest. Why, despite the fact that my apartment is so much more expensive, do I not? So it quickly became obvious that it was a cost issue. Elevators in North America are roughly 3 times as expensive as elevators in Europe, and probably even more expensive than what you find in Asia. So this is just like a basic cost comparison of a 3-stop elevator, or sorry, 4-stop elevator in Switzerland, and then outside of Milan, and then in New York City and Brooklyn. And the top, you can see the sort of raw price, and on the bottom, I did a little bit of very slightly. These are all recent quotes, as you can see. And then did what's called a purchasing power parity adjustment, which accounts somewhat for America's higher cost of living than you generally find, at least in Italy, not so much in Switzerland. And what you see is the elevators in Europe are, for a mid-rise building, they'll be in the mid 5 figures, whereas in the United States, New York City is actually not that much more expensive than. This is pretty much the price everywhere that you'll find. It's in the mid 100s. So at least 3 times the cost, depending on what you're looking at. So as you can imagine, that's going to or not. So this was the project is to understand, why do the elevators cost so much. And something I also soon discovered was, due to the high costs, among other things, the United States has very few elevators compared to other countries. So the main bar here is elevators per 1,000 people. So some of these, these are estimates, but pretty close. States at the very bottom, 3 elevators per 1,000 people. Canada is slightly better. I named my organization the Center for Building and North Pathologies and Construction, as the United States does. And then we see, higher and higher and higher. The most elevator-rich country that I could find, I suspect, is probably Monaco per capita, but the large one that I could find was Greece. Something that Greece, Spain, and Italy have in common is they had massive post-war building booms. Lots of little small elevators and little small buildings. Spain, Greece, Italy, Switzerland, these are tend to be more urban countries than the United States, so you would expect there to be more elevators. But for example, the Netherlands actually has a higher rate of people living in single-family houses than the United States. There's in the Netherlands, about 20% of people live in multifamily housing, and in the United States, it's about 30%. And yet the Netherlands has 40% more elevators per capita than we do. So it's not just our more suburban orientation. We just have fewer elevators, even in the buildings that you'd expect to have them. Something else to keep in mind is the United States has dramatically more commercial space than all of these countries. So you'd expect there to be a lot of elevators in there too. So this was the best comparison I could come up with. But suffice to say, the United States has fewer elevators than anyone else on any sort of metrics that matter. And you can see the absolute numbers are in these thin lines, and you can see 1 million. Italy has about 1 million. Japan is sort of, nearing in on it. Greece has, that's actually a conservative estimate. It's between 425 and 600,000. So about half the number of elevators that we have in absolute terms, despite the fact that Greece has, 3% of the population that we do, much smaller population. So very few elevators. It changes the way that we build buildings on the European or really sort of global apartment building. This is sort of a Germanic floor plan, but you could sort of see it all throughout Europe and a lot of Asia. So when you get a large site, they typically break the building up into what you could call in English point access blocks. These are single stair segments of a building with, typically for a new building, a small elevator. So these floors are actually the same exact size. They're a little under 6,000 square feet. And the one on the top will have 3 stairs, 3 elevators, but each one only serving 1 unit. North American building, what you'd call a double-loaded corridor building. This is driven by a few things. One of them will be, our requirement in North America to include 2 stairs and even sort of low or even mid-rise buildings, which is very uncommon abroad, which is a topic that people have probably heard about, but also the cost of the elevator. The cost of all of the vertical circulation elements are going to make it difficult to break up buildings into smaller components. As a result, it becomes difficult, if your building's broken up horizontal, through the middle because you need to essentially share the vertical circulation, the elevator and the stairs among many units. The units will only face one direction. Reasons have to do with the buildings tend to be a lot thicker. So it's going to be much easier to design studios in 1-bedroom apartments, whereas the building on the top has 2-bedroom apartments. So it does change the whole way we build buildings. We have a lot more walk-ups. My 5-story walk-up that's not legal in most of Europe. In the United States, the International Building Code that we use in the United States actually imposes no requirement to have an elevator at any height. There's a couple sections that look like they're imposing an elevator requirement, but if you dig into them, they're not really. So, our buildings are less likely to have elevators given a certain size, and then given a certain lot dimensions, a developer is more likely to build this double-loaded corridor building that has fewer elevators per capita, of the residents living in the building than in other countries where an elevator is more often to be shared by a very small number of people. So yeah, we have a lot of these walk-up apartment buildings. These are in New York City. As the building codes are, there's a strong movement to reform building codes in the United States to allow more single stair buildings. These are going to be smaller with smaller footprints. The other problem is going to become more acute. Often a surprise to even architects that we don't require elevators really at any height in most of the country. New York City actually does, but in most of the country that uses sort of the vanilla adoption of the International Building Code, they don't require elevators. And this is a surprise because in a larger building, you'll find an elevator, but the 2-stair requirement sort of forces the building to be larger, because to hit a certain efficiency ratio, to have a reasonable amount of your building in the units rather than in the circulation in these 2 stairs, corridor, larger elevator, you need to make the building larger. So we tend not to build a lot of small in the United States. This is in New York City, which does allow single stair buildings up to a certain height and, with a limited size. York City, we get a lot more taller walk-ups because the price of an elevator becomes much more important if you only have 10 or 12 units in the building as opposed to, having 200 units in the building. So in the beginning, I said the cost of the elevator is typically about 2% of the total hard cost of construction. It's actually surprisingly stable across countries. It's true in Switzerland, where, an elevator and a price adjusted basis is about 35K. And it's true in New York, where an elevator is, 160K for a 4-story building. And how this is achieved is we simply don't include the elevators in these smaller buildings. These 3 buildings in Switzerland would absolutely have an elevator. In New York City, there's no question that they would not have an elevator. You could combine the buildings in the rest of the country where you can't have single stair buildings and buildings in a small footprint wouldn't be viable. You could combine the buildings, then the building might have an elevator. But as jurisdictions across the United States reform their building codes to allow single stair buildings, you're going to get smaller footprint buildings, and there's going to be more temptation from developers and architects to leave out the elevator. Seattle allows single stair buildings. That's along with New York City. It's one of the few jurisdictions in America that does above 3 stories. And there are a lot of 4, 5, and 6-story walk-ups being built in Seattle because at the price that the elevator companies will charge you, the rent is not enough to justify it. And you could require an elevator, but it's going to kill a lot of deals. My apartment could have never been built with an elevator requirement, at least to the size that we require. So we also just often don't build apartment buildings at all in this country. So this is a site in probably Seattle, and it is zoned for a mid-rise density, and it is sort of the density and height that in Europe would be in a small apartment building, probably a lot like my mom's apartment building. But you notice they didn't build an apartment building at all. They built a bunch of townhouses. And there's a lot of things that go into this. It's not just the elevator. We have condo defect liability laws that are especially brutal on the West Coast that make architects and developers and engineers not even want to risk having their insurance premiums rise because of the inevitable lawsuits over condo defects. There's also, not in Seattle, but in other places, there's issues with, requiring 2 stairs and a lot of different egress, sort of intense egress requirements in apartment buildings. I'm sure there's financing constraints as well, but a big issue is the elevator. You can sidestep the whole issue by just breaking your site up into a lot of townhouses. So we get a lot of these. They're not very efficient. You have a lot of stair in the building. They're very large. They tend to be like quite large units, but like with sort of low bedroom counts. So this is one of the other ways that the high cost of elevators affects the buildings that we build. So 3 reasons for this high cost to explain the effects. Now let's talk about the causes of them. The most obvious one is the one that was the first thing I noticed, and my hypothesis was that this was probably most of the issue. It's a big issue. It's not most of the issue. It's huge cabin sizes. On the left is a standard elevator from Europe. So the width of the cabin is 1.1 meters, which is about, 3 feet and some change. And then the depth is 1.4 meters, which is about 4 feet. This is large enough to accommodate, the largest wheelchairs, power chairs, and then someone standing behind them. It is not large enough to accommodate a turning radius of a wheelchair, but I would say this is the standard elevator size for new construction around the world. If you've been to Europe, and especially sort of like old city centers like Paris or Barcelona or Rome, you've probably seen some very small elevators. Some, you can't even bring your luggage in the cabin. You have to send the luggage up first. Those do not meet modern European standards. That's not what they're building in new buildings in Europe. But they are much small. Even the new ones are much smaller. This is I believe it's called a Type 2 elevator in Europe. And this is the standard requirement for a mid-rise building pretty much everywhere. And in some of the countries that have the most elevators, they'll allow this even in a high-rise. Spain, for example, will allow this in a high-rise building. The standard elevator for a new construction, it's 3,500 pounds. Oh, sorry. So the one on the left, elevators are typically measured in not their cabin dimensions, but their capacity, which scales sort of roughly with the cabin dimensions, the interior dimensions. So in Europe, it's 630 kilograms, which is a little shy of 1,400 pounds. So in the United States, the standard elevator is a 3,500 pound elevator. The cabin size is about twice the size as Europe. And it is scaled this large for 2 reasons. One is that there is now a requirement that the wheelchair be able to make a full turn. And then the second one is a stretcher requirement. Europe and Asia will often require a stretcher for a high-rise building, but because there's not this turning radius requirement, it ends up being actually just as wide as the wheelchair elevator, 1.1 meters, but 2.1 meters deep. So it's skinny and long, just sort of big enough for the stretcher and then 2 paramedics or something standing on the side. Whereas in the United States, the wheelchair turning radius forces the cabin to be wide, and then the gurney, the stretcher, is usually placed diagonally. So the wheelchair turning radius, it's a little unclear to me how this came about. Elevators in the United States were always larger for historical reasons. I suspect it wasn't super well thought out when it was imposed in a couple decades ago, and they just sort of took a standard elevator and saw in wheelchair requirement. There wasn't a lot of discussion, at least that I can tell. The stretcher requirement is a little newer. The stretcher requirement is newer, and the stretchers have been getting the stretcher requirement is getting larger and larger over time. So to give you an example of how this kind of code development works, at some point up until recently, the stretchers required were 6'4". And Glendale, Arizona, in the early to mid 2000s, who said, they're building a sports arena in my jurisdiction, and I don't think so can fit the stretchers. Best with at least very little documented discussion about cost. They don't really, these codes and standard writing bodies, which we'll get into later, don't document these things very well, but there's, I need to fit it. Imagine if it was you in the wheelchair. There's no consideration of the fact that as cost rises, you're less likely to have an elevator in a building at all. At the time, I'm not sure that there were any apartment buildings with elevators in Glendale, Arizona. Today, there may be a few, but not very many. So it's not a jurisdiction that even has very many apartment buildings. The concern was over a sports arena, which I think you could actually make a very strong case should have a large elevator. But it was imposed across the entire International Building Code, which applies to even very small apartments. It's usually only one elevator serving each apartment. So this is an example of how these things are no cost benefit analysis. So if we look, what is the impact of this cost? If we look between a European standard wheelchair elevator and a US stretcher elevator, I think cutting the size would reduce the cost by about a quarter or a third, which is substantial, but not most of the gaps. So there are other issues. So another issue, union work rules. This is not something I was expecting to find. So wages in the United States are very high, but more importantly, the elevator union is very strong. It's probably the most unionized trade in construction in the United States and Canada. And not only have they negotiated very high wages, but probably more importantly, there's a lot of focus on what's called work preservation, which is that historically, there was a lot of labor that went into installing an elevator. And given that labor is the most expensive cost in construction, there's been a huge effort in the rest of the world, especially in Europe, to shrink the labor that's required in the elevator shaft and to do more work in a factory. So as an example, this is I think what's called a bed plate. It's essentially a thing that sits at the top of the elevator, connects various parts together, and there's holes in it that need to be drilled and then to attach different parts together. And it doesn't really make sense to be drilling holes on the site since these are mass-produced parts. It's cheaper to do it in the factory, given the factories are often lower wage countries. It's also just more precise. You can do it with machines, and it's safer because you're not sort of in this little tight shaft working at the top of an open shaft. So in the rest of the world, they drill these holes in the factory. In North America, the International Union of Elevator Constructors. This is a theme throughout North American construction, by the way, is they stick the word international in front of something that is really just only the United States or sometimes also Canada. So the International Union of Elevator Constructors has come to an agreement with the elevator companies that they get to drill certain holes, and then certain holes get drilled in the factory, and then certain holes, the elevator unions traditionally have the right to drill, but in practice, they can't do it precisely enough in the shaft. So they drill what's called a pilot hole in the factory, which is a small hole in the factory. And then on site, the mechanic makes it larger. So anyway, this is a small example, but there's things all throughout the elevator that have these sort of like inefficiencies that the union has negotiated, which is an agreement between two private parties. So it's not like a direct role for government and policy here, but I'll get into, and then perhaps in the next slide, how government policy reinforces the hand of the union, especially. So then the third major issue is a lack of standards harmonization. Europe has traditionally been in the 20th century has been the global home of the elevator. 3 of the 4 major manufacturers are based, and they have the most. They had historically the most elevators per capita, still do. They by China absolutes, but so anyway, the European Union has harmonized the safety code across Europe, and including the whole rest of the world, except for Japan, has adopted this European, what's called the European norm 81. Across a global market, elevators are safety critical components, so it's very important to certify every part that that it complies with relevant safety rules. So by creating one set of rules throughout the whole world, if you manufacture a part, you can sell it all over the world. It allows smaller companies to enter, expand, compete. So the elevator industry in Europe and Asia is very competitive. There still are the same four companies, Schindler, Kone, ThyssenKrupp, and Otis, sort of dominate all around the world, but there are smaller and mid-sized competitors that exert pressure and that force these larger companies to remain competitive, to not agree to excessive union contracts, especially with regards to work rules. But in the United States, we have stuck to our own codes. And it means that if you manufacture a part, you cannot sell it in the United States if you certify it to the global standard. You have to pay, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of dollars to have it certified for the North American market, which is a very small market. There's only 1 million devices here compared to 6 or more million in the European Union and then 10 plus million in China. So as a result, not many small to mid-sized firms are willing to certify their parts to the North American market. So we get a much, much smaller market for parts. Here's an example. This is a door company called Witter, or sorry, it's a parts manufacturer called Witter. On the left is their European or rest of the world site, where you can see there's, I don't know, 21 different landing doors that they offer. And on the right, you can see their North American site, and the offerings are much smaller. So this is a company that is large enough to certify some parts of the North American market, but not a ton of them. So we see, this is a very common theme in elevators. We see a very competitive market abroad, whittled down to a very uncompetitive sort of oligopolistic market in the United States. Going back to the other side, not only do we have our own safety code that walls us off from the whole world of parts, and also makes it very difficult for example, smaller manufacturers that haven't already signed a very difficult agreement with the union to enter the market in the United States. So it reinforces the position of these unionized companies that have agreed to these very onerous work rule terms, and doesn't really, if there's no small to mid-sized competitors nipping at their heels, they're not going to want to risk the labor tension of saying, at this next contract, you can have your $50 an hour plus $30 benefits, but we're drilling these holes in the factory. We're not going to let you drill, we're not going to let you re-drill holes in the elevator shaft because we want to drive these prices down so that we can compete with these mid-sized firms like Arona or Witter or Schmidt and Sohn or various Japanese manufacturers. So not only do we have this special elevator code, but this will be familiar to any architect working with different IBC iterations in the United States. There's, each jurisdiction feels like it's adopting a separate version of it. So the darker colors are the more recent versions. You can see those are the states that don't have a ton of elevators. Illinois, New York, California. These have stayed on older elevator codes. They modify it in ways that are, for example, the state of Washington has an elevator board, and the state of Seattle has an elevator board, and they're different. So the state of Washington, how many real experts are there that are going to be able to properly evaluate the costs and benefits of new technologies and allowing them or disallowing them? You're not going to have a lot of that expertise. And what's going to dominate these elevator boards is the mechanics who are unionized, who are going to fight labor saving innovation. So one example is in testing. Historically, if the elevator is rated for 3,500 pounds, historically you'd bring more than 3,500 pounds of weight into the elevator. You would, cut one of the safety devices off, and then you'd see how far the elevator fell down the rail before the various safety devices engaged. Very important. Nowadays, we can do this electronically. You don't have to bring all these weights into the cab. The weights are very expensive to haul around. The elevator manufacturers maintain that there's a lot of injuries that result from hauling around, literally tons of weights into a cabin. So in Europe, especially in Germany, they've pioneered electronic forms of testing, which some mid-sized European manufacturers have been trying to bring to the United States for for a while. They have not really succeeded. They've seen a lot of opposition. One of the most telling things I saw was that the elevator board in somewhere in the Midwest said, the manufacturer is explaining that, like, we have these all throughout we have these all throughout Europe. We have them, in Canada, they're common. We have them in a couple of US jurisdictions. And, the mechanic says, do we really want to be the first in the Midwest to adopt this? And it's like, well, why is, is physics different in the Midwest? Like, what is important about being the first in the Midwest to adopt it? So this is the mentality of a lot of these boards. So as we can see, there's companies that have not entered the market as a result. So Arona is a major mid-sized manufacturer but they have presence pretty much everywhere in the world. But what is one of the holes in especially a high-income country? It's the United States and Canada. They've never entered the United States and Canada. And this is a firm that, like I said, has not already signed a contract with the union. And so it's difficult for them to enter the market because they would have to recertify all their parts and probably realistically change a lot of them to accommodate our sort of massive elevator cabins. So they haven't entered the market. So, Otis and Schindler and the ones that have sort of agreed to these various onerous work rule terms have not had the competitive pressure to stand up to that, to maybe even risk a strike, and to stand up to the union and accept more pre-assembly and prefabrication parts. So zooming out from elevators, like I said, the elevator is 2% of the market, 2% of the cost of construction of a building. It's not that big, but we see these issues everywhere. So the cabin size is an issue of over-dimensioning, the labor is a labor issue, and the lack of harmonization of the elevator safety standard. So we see these everywhere. So in the over-dimensioning, when it comes to egress, the United States generally, if the building is above 3 stories, if the apartment building is above 3 stories, will require 2 stairs, where the rest of the world, usually the requirement doesn't kick in until, frankly, it's a high-rise building. In some countries, in Switzerland and South Korea, they never require a second stair. You can have a skyscraper with a single stair. Most of the world, there's some requirement for a 2-stair, but it's usually a rise building. In the rest of the world, you can have sort of an open stair, which makes for a very nice picture, sort of encourages people to take the stair. I don't mean open in the sense of outside, but open in the sense of, you open your apartment door and you can see the first step. It's not hidden away in a shaft. We require a corridor in the middle. Another example mentioning is ventilation piping. You need to introduce air into a plumbing network to ensure that waste drains out properly. In the United States, we require every set of fixtures to be separately ventilated. In most of the rest of the world, for a mid-rise building, they'll just allow a little branch at the top of the piping system. The plumbing, and then our drainage piping is much wider than it is in the rest of the world, given low flow fixtures and the fact that people don't generally, in an apartment building, all decide to flush their toilets all at once. We, in the rest of the world, they sort of allowed smaller diameter drainage pipes. In the United States, we require them to be very large. These plumbing code items in particular, the model code, the standard body, sort of private nonprofit entities that tend to be dominated by engineers and plumbers who have a real vested interest in creating as much work as possible, which I'll get into in a moment. On the labor side, the United States has a massive undocumented workforce. In Europe, since the accession of the Eastern European countries into the European Union, they're sort of equivalent of Latin American workers or Eastern European workers. And when I go to see my mother, I'm very cheap, so I take a low-cost airline, and I'm on the plane with a bunch of workers, and they get to go home for Christmas, they can go home for birthdays, they can go home for funerals. They're not paying cartels $10,000 to cross the border every time they want to cross. They can get licensed, very important. They can, they have the stability in life that they can, increase their skills. Whereas in the United States, there's for an undocumented construction worker, which is about a quarter of the workforce, there's a ceiling. You cannot really rise above a certain level, especially in a high regulatory code. Whereas in Europe, you might start out, doing masonry, something that's sort of more physically taxing, less intellectually difficult. And then, you see, oh, the plumbers, the electricians are making more money. As a Romanian, I've come to Germany, I've learned German, I've learned how to do things. Now I'm going to go and become an electrician, make a little more money. You don't see that kind of mobility in the United States. Undocumented workers spend a lot of time, know, trying to get healthcare, trying to, transportation, and it leaves less time to improve skills. And not just improve skills, but also like be recognized for those skills with licensure. Labor, the other issue, the boards tend to be dominated by unionists or the interests of engineers who, really benefit from over-dimensioning. Another an example is in New York City, we don't tend to use cranes, especially tower cranes, because higher spends that is sort of dominated by the union. There's all sorts of union fights over modular factories. The lack of standards harmonization, this is a big issue. The United States has two different universal plumbing code, kind of funny they call it the universal one. And then on the East Coast, there's the international plumbing code. The one on the West Coast is not universal. The one on the East Coast is not national. There's sort of these two warring boards. The one on the West Coast, I think, tends to be more dominated by union interests. The one on the East Coast is sort of run by the same company, same nonprofit, writes the International Building Code, which is again not very international. We have our electrical standards in the United States are different. They're based on NFPA. Well, it's NFPA 70, the National Electric Code. The rest of the world, which is sort of harmonizing on European standard by the IEC, which is based in Switzerland. And this makes it difficult to trade electrical. The United States is switch out different refrigerants. So what it means is the newer models of heat pumps are just not available in North America. Sorry. Okay, so our approach to codes and standards development is very different from the rest of the world. In the rest of the world, usually these are sort of these bodies that set the codes are dominated by government, and they're not just dominated by government, they actually sit within the government. It's the National Ministry of Housing or whatever is writing these codes. The United States, the federal government has historically taken a hands-off role, and in the 1970s took a really hands-off role. The only code that is written by the federal government is the what's called the HUD code, the Manufactured Housing Code for trailer homes, which has done a pretty good job of creating a national market and keeping costs down. In the United States, we defer to these various standards writing bodies. The International Code Council writes the building code. They're the big one. NFPA writes the electrical code, sprinkler code, some sort of like parallel building code called the NFPA 101, the life safety code. These organizations do not spend a lot of time thinking about cost. Their voting structures tend to be biased towards suburban and rural interests. So as an example, the International Code Council has a voting structure that, well, essentially a rural jurisdiction gets a lot stronger of a weight than a more urban jurisdiction. They've also cut agreements with the National Association of Home Builders to make the committees that cover residential construction, that cover single and two-family construction much more dominated by developer interests, whereas the multifamily in the multifamily committees, there's much less interest from developers in those. This is something I've learned very recently, and I think drives a lot of my thinking about construction and codes. And that is, in the United States, we have developed codes that penalize multifamily construction in a lot of ways and raise costs. So I think it's, everyone in North America knows that as the building gets denser, the cost rises, the per square foot cost rises. Are the United States and Canada, very similar code environments. And so we have a single family house, low-rise apartment, what would be called a garden apartment, it's a wood frame apartment, but with more services, especially, more intense plumbing, more intense electrical, sprinklers. So the cost rises. And then we have a mid-rise apartment that is, or mid or high rise, which is typically made of concrete, and the cost rises even further. So as the building gets denser, the per square foot cost just rises and rises and rises. There are a lot of diseconomies of scale in construction, so you would imagine this would be the case. As you go taller, the structural requirements get more intense, the egress requirements in terms of stairs, elevators get more intense. But you'd also imagine that there's some economies of scale in construction, that is things that you save as things get more dense. You only need one basement, you only need one roof. And yet, in other countries, these balance each other out. So we see that in Germany, which is the yellow line, in Italy, which is the orange, and in Mexico, which is the green, the cost of construction as the building rises, the per square foot or per square meter cost, stays either the same or maybe even falls. So we've created a policy environment in the United States and Canada where the denser the building, the more expensive it is. There are no savings from apartments. In fact, there are a lot of costs. And I think we accept this as natural in the United States, but I don't think it's natural. I suspect if you looked at every other country in the world, you'd find what you find in, Germany, Italy, and Mexico, which is that the costs stay relatively flat. And this is probably not driven by labor exactly, or at least not different access to different labor pool. Well, shouldn't say that. Anyway, it's driven by a policy environment fundamentally. And one of my goals is to figure out exactly why. So, I see it in the elevator, but it's interesting to think about how it plays out in other parts of the building, how we've bifurcated our structural market, structural materials market, between low-rise wood frame on the one hand and concrete and steel on the other end. The MEP services, the requirements get very intense in the United States as the building gets taller. You have sprinklers that just frankly don't really exist in the rest of the world. The rest of the world doesn't include sprinklers in multifamily buildings, more or less. More intense electrical requirements, certainly more intense elevator requirements. So something I'm interested in researching more in the future is why. I'm interested in thoughts. You'll see my email at the end. Send me your thoughts. But I think this is a really important chart to understand like some of the key pathologies of American construction. Why have we made it so difficult to build apartments? On the flip side, maybe we've made it very easy to build single family houses. You can see that in Germany, the single family houses are more expensive than ours. So anyway, this is something that I've been thinking a lot about. I'm going to go through this one quickly. The fire service plays a really big role in code development in the United States. They actually get a vote that's on par with the building departments. And historically, if the firefighter said something, everyone says, oh, okay, we're not doing that. But more recently, I think there's been more questioning of claims and decisions from the fire service. So the big one in the code world was that in single family houses, the model codes do require sprinklers, but almost very few states, only California and Maryland, have adopted that. The fire service put up a huge fight against single stair buildings, and the fight is still ongoing, but they seem to be losing that fight. And then the fire service has, in cities across the US, has been like really resistant to narrowing streets to bike lanes and wider sidewalks. And it was sort of radicalizing moment for a lot of politicians to see, firefighters coming out against bike lanes when, we have there's more than 10 times as many Americans die in car crashes as they do in fires, and we have a high rate of fire death. So I think it put a lot of questions in policymakers' minds about whether they should just take these claims uncritically. So yeah, there's more pushback to the fire service than there once was. So anyway, that's my presentation. Happy to take questions.
Stephen, that was amazing. I guess one question I have for you is, you've done a lot of research. What are things that people can do? We've got people on this call who are attorneys, architects, builders. How do we move forward to start addressing some of these issues that you've raised if we all care about building more housing in our communities, in our nation, and around the world?
Yeah, I would say, my focus has been on building codes and standards, and historically there's been a thought, is just sort of sense that this is not an interesting field. This is something, you have to just defer to the experts. The people writing these are the experts, and there's, good logic that goes into all of it. So I would say just a mindset shift in questioning a lot of these. If you dig into the details of how these things are decided, the staffers at these code writing organizations actually do not really do these are what are called consensus organizations, whereby someone makes a proposal and then the committee and the membership vote on it. It's sort of a democratic process. And what we see in our actual democracy is it's not always like a it's not always like a very cerebral exchange of ideas and evaluation and money going into research. So the first thing is, you should question things. When you talk to policymakers and, they're worried about the cost of construction, city council members, state legislators, et cetera, I would say, point to the building code and say, there are issues here. This is something that should be addressed. And then I would say, like, get involved yourselves in it. They can be difficult. They often, the people who get involved tend to be people who can make money by being involved in the building code. So, consultants and things like that. But I would say overall a mindset shift and not viewing these codes as sort of handed on from God, but rather, human creations that have human flaws and often I think have like the biases of the people who write them. These code writing, the people who participate in this code development process tend to be, for whatever reason, just deeply suburban people. And they bring all of the biases of a typical suburbanite to it, to apartment buildings and single family houses and what sort of things should be required in them. I would say, like, follow me, I don't know, follow along and you know, think more about the building code and the standards in general.
Now, I know that some membership organizations like the American Institute of Architects has members who serve as advisors on some of these committees. Can you talk a little bit about how some of these professional organizations actually participate on the code writing or code approval or code recommendation
Yeah,
organization?
yeah. These code writing bodies, they try to have the membership be somewhat representative. Um, and the AIA has historically not taken a big, like, someone once told me they sort of see themselves as the lobby for architects, not architecture. And I have not seen them take a huge interest in these codes. And to the extent that they do, it's often kind of rubber stamping whatever decision has been made. If the firefighter says that something is dangerous, they say, okay, this is dangerous. And at the AIA in particular, I have not seen a great interest in um, thinking more critically about these codes. So I was a proponent on an IBC code change proposal to raise the single stair height limit in multifamily buildings for small multifamily buildings with very limited floor plates from 3 stories to 6 stories, which would still make us one of the more conservative parts of the world, but a little less conservative. The AIA actually spoke out against it. I've been trying to get meetings with them, talk about it. But I think fundamentally they need to hear from their membership. And I think that, if you are a member of the AIA or other professional organizations and you are concerned about the cost of housing and you would like a more global approach to codes and standards, I would say, talk to your local chapter, email, the higher ups and sort of encourage them to engage with the building code reform movement. And these these bodies, these standards writing bodies, it's not like a zoning board hearing where they're kind of just listening to anyone who comes in. Like, they really do value the opinion of large professional organizations. The ones who weigh in the most tend to be the fire service. But I think that if the AIA, if even developer organization, like, developers are not really like a bad word at these places the way that they are in a zoning board hearing. Something that I've heard them say is like, well, you're the first person coming to me asking for this. Like, the developers never seem to care. And the multifamily developers are not that organized, frankly, compared to the single family developers. There's a lot of really big single family developers in this country, whereas multifamily developers tend to be more regional, more local. It's a very local business, and they don't intend to invest as much money in advocating at these codes and standard writing bodies. So, if you're a member of the National Association of Home Builders or the National Multifamily Housing Council or the IAA, or any of these, sort of professional engineering societies, I think it would be helpful for them, the local chapters and the national ones, to hear from their members and say that, this is something we're concerned about. We're concerned about the cost and quality of multifamily housing, and we think you should take a more active role in looking out for cost and quality in the code writing process.
One of the things that I'm always interested in is following the money. And so I'm wondering, where does the funding come from for these regulatory organizations like these these code councils, I guess is the way to frame that. How are they funded? Where does the money go?
Um, so yeah, I mean, they can be quite large. The International Code Council has a budget of almost $100 million. A lot of it comes from selling the documents, and there was a lot of legal drama over this. Historically, they copyrighted these documents, and so the model code is copyrighted. The model code does not have the force of law anywhere, but jurisdictions adopt it, and they usually adopt it by reference. They don't reprint the entire code into statute. They say, we're going to adopt the IBC, except we're changing section 10 in this way and section 3 in this way. And so historically, you had to pay to access these documents. And so they made a lot of money from there. The courts in the United States have, I think, to their credit, said no, when something is adopted into law, it is no longer copyrightable. It is, there's been constant pushback against that, though. So, but they still do make a lot of their money selling the documents, selling access to, for example, the code commentaries. So there's the code, and the code is what even the model code does not directly have the force of law, but if it gets adopted by reference, then it becomes law. But then there's a lot of ambiguities and confusion in the code. It's not always written in the most intuitive way. I find the older the code, the more confusing it is. So, a newer country like Singapore has like a very readable code, whereas, oh my God, the UK is like, they write all their codes by common law practice. It's impossible to find anything in them. So, the United States, the codes can actually be quite old. The International Code Council is only about 2 decades old, but they're building on older codes. So they're very complicated. And so they write these commentaries to them, which don't technically have the force of law anywhere. They're not adopted by reference, but code officials do defer to them. And these code commentaries are sold. I pay $2,000 for a subscription to this, I think every couple of years. They can be quite expensive. The code books can be quite expensive. There's a new one every 3 years that you have to buy, or even better for them, an ongoing subscription. So they do make money on the confusion and ambiguity. As a member, you can ask for things like determinations on sort of confusing questions and issues. I'm not going to say they intentionally make them confusing, but there certainly is an incentive built into the system to make the codes more confusing so that they can sell more documents, and so that the people who participate in the process, who know these codes the best, it improves their consulting services, the power that they have, because they understand it. It improves their sort of ability to get jobs in government, as building officials. They understand the code, they've participated in the process. It's a strange system. It's a strange system. In other places, it's sort of a top-down government system, and here it's this more complex system that has its pluses and minuses, but at least for multifamily housing, I do see a lot of minuses.
Yeah, it would seem that at a local level, it's much easier for local government to just say, okay, we're adapting this whole code, as opposed to actually doing the research, all of the technical work that would
Yeah.
need to be done. And so it's sort of the easiest path, as opposed to necessarily the most productive path, to possibly, start to really address our critical housing needs.
Yeah. And
And so,
the codes have gotten really too complicated for individual jurisdictions to have much of a say in. So historically, every city had its own code. Over time, that, was whittled down to just New York and Chicago, and then just Chicago. And now everyone adopts the IBC with some pretty major modifications in especially New York and Chicago. But unfortunately, it's become too difficult for cities, certainly, and often states, to have really productive input into it and to really question what they see. They do make modifications. I think often the modifications are not good. Sometimes they are, but it really, like, there's a reason they've become harmonized, is because they've become too complicated to handle. So now you really have two options. You can either defer to the codes and standards writing bodies, or how they do it in most countries is the central government takes a leading role. And HUD and NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, was more involved in this. In the 70s, they took a step back. I think in the 90s, there was even a official document published that said they weren't going to get involved in it. So it just leaves the standard writing bodies to run the whole process.
Wow, Stephen, I wish we had another hour to chat, but unfortunately, we're reaching the end of our time together. We're so delighted to meet you. Thank you so much for sharing your research, and thanks to our audience for participating today. As I mentioned, this webinar will be recorded and placed on the CFI website. Be sure to share the link with your colleagues. We'll also have it available in podcast format, but with all these great slides, it seems like looking at this presentation will be really critical to overall understanding of it. So interestingly enough, our next webinar is with Ryan Kolker, who's the Vice President of Innovation at the International Code Council on September 18th at 8 a.m. Pacific time. Registration will be on our website and via LinkedIn. I'm sure Stephen's going to join us for that conversation, and we encourage all of you to join us too. I'd like to express my special thanks to the amazing Katie Olson, who makes all the magic happen with CFI social media and webinars. Thanks everyone for attending, and we'll see you next time.